everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you here today on this Baltic event, where we'll look at different issues such as the Chinese influence, as well as particular issues associated with the case of Latvia in terms of defense and security. And I'm very glad that we have the great honor for this event to be opened by Representative Don Bacon. Let us give the floor to him.
Thank you.
Appreciate it,
sir. So, welcome here for all those who are visiting the Capitol. It's great to have you, and I appreciate seeing all of our allies and representatives of our allies here, and I love working with you. I just want to open up by saying 2 weeks ago, I was asked by an Estonian senior leader, and he goes, Don, why are you so active with the Baltic Security Caucus, and why are you so involved and wanting to make a difference here? What do you get out of it? Do you have a lot of Baltic citizens in Omaha, or Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian citizens? And I go, well, we have a few Lithuanian. We have some Latvians down in Lincoln, but it's not about what's in it for me. This is about defending freedom, standing by what's right, standing by our friends. I do believe America has an indispensable role in defending our values, but we don't do it alone. We can't do it alone. China's economy is nearing our strength, our level of GDP. They're at 90%. We see what Russia is doing right now with a totally modernized nuclear capability and what they're doing in Ukraine. Of course, we have other potential threats out there with Iran working on a nuclear weapon, and North Korea, and I just go on and on. America has to work with a team, and we can't do it alone. We have to have strong, great allies. And I work for that premise because freedom, respect of humanity, and civil rights, respecting human dignity, the free market system. I go on and on. Those are the values we hold dear, and if we just crawl back into this isolationist mode, that's a minority of our country citizens seem to be wanting. But we saw how that worked in 1938. It did not work well. So we have to be involved. We don't want to be overzealous either and provoke fights, but we have to defend freedom. So I work for that premise up front. And I think no other group of countries can I say that it's been the most bold, courageous, in embracing the values that we hold dear than Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. I traveled there in 2003 when I was a lieutenant colonel, and I was seeing these, just got to meet these countries there, and I've been there since then as a congressman. But what you all have done when you gained your freedom from a Soviet Union or Russia, I guess it was all at the same time there, that transition, you had a choice to make. Do you embrace freedoms immediately? Do you rip the Band-Aid off fast? Or do you try to do it gradual like some of the other countries did? But what our three Baltic friends did, they said, we're going to embrace freedom right now, the free market system right now. And you did it the hard way, but you did it the right way. And I look at the success today, when you look at the economies and everything that's been accomplished, successful democracies. I think all freedom-loving countries can be proud of what you've accomplished and what our friends have accomplished. It really is a credit to democracy and the strength of character, what has been done here. And we stand by you. That's what we do, because you've embraced what we embrace. And I've also served in NATO. I was a NATO when I was a colonel. I served out of Jamestown with a colleague of mine in the backpack flood. And I know the threats that are facing Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The threats are really there. And if we know that now, when we saw the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which basically is saying might makes right. That's what Putin's saying. And he's saying, going back to Peter the Great, these countries belong in our domain. We want them back. I think that's what he's saying. I think he doesn't even acknowledge Ukraine as a people at this point. They want to assimilate it, get rid of anything Ukraine, say there's no nationality, it's all Russian, part of the Russian culture. It's all about restoring the old Russia, in my view. That's how I see what Putin's doing. Well, we can't deny the fact that he's called the Baltic states renegade states. Using that term it implies to me very strongly that these three countries belong to Russia. And that is unacceptable. We have to take Putin at his word when he's making these statements and say that is not a veiled threat. To me, that is a blatant threat against our NATO allies. And we've got to be prepared for it. We need to deter him from ever going down this path. So, working with my colleagues, I'm very proud to have been a supporter of the Baltic Security Initiative, which we have about $250 million slotted to go to all three countries on top of what else NATO normally does. This is an additional amount of spending. And we know that we need to work on air defenses. We need to work on anti-shipping. We need to work on really anything that helps deter Russians from thinking they can have an easy win if they invade. So we're going to work this year. I can't obviously promise what we can do. I'll promise what we'll try to do. We're going to try to get this to $500 million, and we'll work it as hard as we can. But the goal is to ensure that Russia knows they cannot win in an invasion. I also believe that we need to have permanent forces in the Baltics, assuming that the three countries agree to that, right? Which I believe they do. But that's the only way to guarantee, in Russia's mind, that we're there to fight, and we're not going to try to come in later to take back. So therefore, I know there's been discussions on this. I think we need a division in the Baltic states. Not necessarily all of America. It could be American Brigade. It could be a combination of NATO countries that make up this division. Perhaps a second division in Poland. I believe that's really the only way to have solid, convincing deterrence. As you know, deterrence, you got to have intent and capability. And I think by putting a division there, you show intent and capability that will deter. So that's really my main message to you, is that we have a lot of work to do. If we want to get forces there, we're going to have NATO itself say this is what they want, right? I can preach it from the House Armed Services Committee. We need to hear from our friends that this is what you also want. But in the end, we've got to have NATO say, hey, this is our plan. And I feel very confident Congress will approve it and fund our part of that, if that is the decision made by NATO. I know today you're talking about China. I'm so proud of our Lithuanian friends for how they've treated China and how they've acknowledged Taiwan and worked so close to Taiwan. And I believe that they represent the feelings of all three countries when it comes there, and it is needed. We got to know that China is watching the Baltic states, watching Ukraine, and they're pushing you all to not acknowledge Taiwan and they're trying to force everybody down the same path. But they're watching what we're doing in Europe and what is happening in Europe and making determinations how they're going to respond to Taiwan. So I think how we respond is not only important to Ukraine and the Baltics, but also what happens with China and Taiwan. So I look forward to hearing some of the discussions with this. I've obviously focused a lot on Russia. I focused a lot on China. They're both threats in different ways that we have to be prepared for. So I look forward to hearing the comments from my fellow friends and colleagues up here, and I appreciate having a chance to open up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Bacon. Also, thank you very much to the Baltic Caucus for hosting us here. Now, let us have the opening addresses of the organizations of this event. And the first, I will give the floor to the President of the Baltic Security Foundation, Mr. Olevs.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies. This is a great occasion for us, and I really thank you, Don Bacon, for hosting us today. I would say it short. Actually, a person who says we're going to be short, it's a long speech.
It's
really short opening remarks. So, the Baltic countries are on the front line of the freedom, and this story is something that must be told and shown to the world. And this is our mission at the Baltic Security Foundation, as we conduct security research and create a network for Baltic experts. And today we highlight the most important part of our work, as we have published so far 6 books and more reports, and hosted conferences in Helsinki, Berlin, and Washington, organized tens of workshops, engaged many experts around the world. Through the Transatlantic Security Exchange, We engage master's, graduate students of international relations, around 30 American students from the best US universities have already participated in the program, interning with the Baltic Security Foundation and using the opportunity to visit the Baltic countries and conduct their research. Resilience education program is the third most important pillar of our work that provides opportunity for our society members to learn skills that would be most useful in building a resilient society. Examples include cooperation with schools on cyber hygiene and countering disinformation, as well as language courses for 350 Ukrainian refugees in the region. Chinese influence in the Baltic Sea region is another story that requires our attention and additional thinking. We wish great success in opening this discussion today along with a new book. I would like to thank the Jamestown Foundation, the Baltic American Freedom Foundation, J-Bank, and Professor Thornton at the Texas A&M University. And of course, we would like to thank House Baltic Caucus and its co-chair, Representative Don Bacon, for hosting this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And now let me give the floor to the Managing Director of the Joint Baltic American National Committee, Mr. Olevs.
Thank you, Otto, and thank you, Congressman Bacon, for being here, for co-chairing the House Baltic Caucus. It's very important. I appreciate your comments. I really do. I know that I've been thinking about how the Baltics really do have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. These are challenging times, as you know. But I first wanted to say hello to everyone here who came to this event, to the ambassador, to others from the embassies who are also here today, and to the other organizers. This is the second event that we've had with the Baltic Security Foundation, so I appreciate the cooperation that we've had over the years. We were last together here in 2019, and it's always great doing whatever with Glen Howard and the Jamestown Foundation. It's known Glen for a long time, and also the Baltic American Freedom Foundation, who was one of the co-sponsors. I just came back from a conference in Estonia at the Baltic Defense College, and I think I've never in my whole life heard the word deterrence as I did during those 2 days. Deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. And it's very important. There are a lot of challenges with Ukraine right now, a lot that needs to be done, a lot more that we can do. So it's important to work together for Ukraine's victory as soon as possible. So can't stress that enough. And then the new challenges with China, and this is sort of a new area for many of us. We're sort of out of area because we've been, as representatives of the Baltic American communities in the U.S., our focus for over 6 years has been on Russia, but we see that Russia isn't the only bad actor. So there are a lot of things that we're going to be finding out in the relationship that the United States and other countries have with China this year. And there's really not much more that I'm going to say right now, other than it's still winter in the Baltics. There was snowing in Tartu a couple days ago, and it was nice to be in Riga again. So appreciate the opportunities to engage and to further cooperate in making sure the Baltic Security Initiative is fully funded, and even more so this year.
We're working.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And now for the concluding opening remarks, let me give the floor to Mr. Howard, the President of the Jamestown Foundation.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. My name is Glen Howard, President of Jamestown Foundation. Maybe you're familiar with our work. We deal with research analysis, and I'm sure you read the Eurasia Daily Monitor, but also hopefully you may read the China Brief, one of our major publications that deals with China. So Jamestown is, you know, when Jamestown's having a good month, when the Russian Minister of Defense and Russian government issue a démarche about the work of the Jamestown Foundation. In fact, this book here alone has gotten 3 press releases and condemnations from the Russian government just since the start of this year. So you know you're doing something right when it's getting their attention. But my purpose in being here today is also to commend this excellent work that Olevs and Otto put together called Between Brussels and Beijing. And it's a very, very important work. And I really think it's important that we kind of understand the dimensions of how China is changing its presence and its shadow in Europe. Now, many of you know, I'm sure you know your history quite well, but there was something called the Napoleonic Continental System that was in place from 1806 to 1814. Now, what is important about this is that it was a form of economic coercion used against Great Britain because Napoleon was anxious to control all the ports and all the access for the trade from continental Europe. Now, when this book talks about Between Brussels and Beijing, it's very important because the economic coercion component of what China is doing certainly matters because the Baltic has always found itself between somebody else. So it's either between the European Union or it's between Russia, and now we have a shadow of China looming over the region. And this book is very, very important because it highlights a lot of important issues that I myself have thought about, and I commend you for the research. For example, the dimension of Germany being in the Baltic and being a Baltic neighbor to the 3 Baltic states is very critically important. As many of you probably read, you know that China is developing what they call the Arctic Road as a part of its aspect of trade with Europe. So in this book you have a section component talking about China and Finland, which is important because of that trade nexus that is developing. If many of you probably read the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, there was an article about Chinese cranes operating in many American ports and the eavesdropping equipment that were inside those cranes, as well as, what did they say, 2,000 Chinese nationals working in American ports on PRC passports monitoring this system. So just think about American capabilities in the Baltic and loading and offloading equipment and what that might mean for the Baltic states in terms of whether China is an ally or isn't an ally of Russia. Now Xi is President Xi of China is president. He's coming to a major visit to meet with Putin. We don't know the date yet. But caught in the middle of all this is the Ukraine war. And we have major strategic aspects like whether China will come in and provide Russia with military weapons. We already see Iranian drones flying all over in the Russian military forces, flying attacks and bombing Kiev. So that's very critically important, but right now we haven't seen China get behind Russia fully in the war yet. We don't know what's going to happen with that. But what we do see in the front lines in Ukraine is an important aspect of what they call the DJI drones flying back and forth used by the Russians that are commercial Hobby Lobby drones they buy, and what the Ukrainians use. And they're engaging in dogfights between these different drones. Now the rumor is that China's going to cut off the supply, as reported by The Economist earlier this week, that they were going to cut off the supply for the Russians. It would be significant. But if the Russians are running out of ammunition, as they say, then it's important what role China will play in this region. So whether you're talking about the Baltic states or Russia, you do have the shadow of China hanging over the Baltic. And it's also hanging over that of Russia. Will it be an ally? Will it be a fully committed ally? We don't know that. But we do know that the Baltic states are trying to develop relations with Taiwan. We've seen the precedent of Lithuania and what they're trying to do. So increasingly the Baltic states are caught in this. But increasingly you're also seeing countries like South Korea becoming major arms exporters to Poland. And now they're trying to get a corner of the market in Finland with the Finnish military. So you're starting to see Asia in this nexus coming in between, which is why I started off with the continental bloc, but also goes back to anybody who's followed the geopolitics of Mackinder will know that there's the Eurasian heartland that they call the pivot. And so are we seeing another age where between the Pacific and between the Baltic states of this pivotal area of Eurasia becoming a major seat of contest? As Mackinder said, who rules Eastern Europe? And Eurasia is the world island. And who controls that? Controls the balance of power. And the balance of power is something that Henry Kissinger said he spent many, many decades trying to get Americans educated on, was the balance of power and understanding about how if one country tilts under the gravity of another great power, how it changes the balance of power in Europe. And that's just something Americans have always, and why Kissinger highlighted this emphasis was because it's so critically important to us. And the Baltic is a part of that balance of power, Eurasia is part of the balance of power, and whoever controls the world island will have a major say in that. And I think that's why we see the contest going on inside Ukraine so bitterly right now. And you've seen Xi present his peace plan for Ukraine, which is a major significant development. We don't know what's up, what's happening with that, whether they're trying to be an ally of Russia or not. But this is the shadow that's going on in the context for what's happening with the Baltic states and been this tug of war for power and influence among its neighbors and increased with the shadow of China over it. I hope you pick up a copy and enjoy it. Thanks to Otto and Olevs for putting on the wonderful event today, and Congressman Bacon for being there.
So let me introduce myself. I am Otto Tabuns, the director of the Baltic Security Foundation, and it will be my pleasure to moderate the first panel of today, which will deal with the concepts and ideas that we have looked at in our China book, or in its full name, Between Brussels and Beijing. I think it will be very interesting to compare the different perspectives that our distinguished panelists will be able to provide for us. Not only the military and defense side, if we talk in terms of strategy, but also how it is complemented by the aspect of financial security, and of course the dimension of human rights, which is something that is important for us in the Western world very much. So for that purpose, I will give the floor, and perhaps we can start with Mr. Howard, so that he would have the chance also to continue on some of the great points he already outlined at the beginning of his address. And so if you press the mic, so it should work. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Olevs and Otto, for having me here today and for your excellent work on this book project. I think it was very important for when Otto and Olevs began this project that they tried to address what is happening inside the Baltic. Many of us saw the developments happening with Lithuania, the desire for Lithuania to try to distance itself between its relationship with the People's Republic of China and gravitating more to Taiwan. Now you're seeing all three of the different Baltic states kind of developing closer ties and interaction with Taiwan, certainly following the lead by the United States in that. Now, when I began my presentation by talking about the continental system, because it's very important when you're looking in Eurasia to understand that the importance of Mackinder's heartland concept was that strategically this area between the Pacific and Eurasia is of becoming greater geopolitical importance, and the direction that China goes in its interaction with Europe is very, very important. It's important because China is trying to develop all the infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative, going to Europe, trying to develop these ties, using the trade and to transport these connections, and certainly seeing that with the dispute over Chinese investment in Hamburg, and how that is developing, certainly catching the attention of the United States. But as this develops between this area, it's also monumental importance because it's an area that we at Jamestown very much take great pride in, because we view ourselves in Washington as one of the great aggregators of Eurasia. And by that I mean that Jamestown is very well positioned to talk about China and the former post-Soviet space because of what our daily publications and writings about Eurasia. And because of that research and analysis focus, we're certainly in that very good position to be able to talk about all of that. So the importance of this book is it brings together, ties together all these missing elements about where the Baltic fits into that. And it's a continuation of that, and I think it's very important. And I think that one of the things in there that when you're looking at the next U.S. administration that's coming in, and assuming that it's Roger Robinson is successful becoming President of the United States, and Roger sits down in the Oval Office and says, okay, Team Robinson, we won the elections, what are going to be our policies? And so one of the things that the president has the right to set the agenda for is going to be what are we going to do about China, and will we do a full throttle decoupling of relations with China, or will we do a steady kind of disentanglement with China? And those will be the major policy issues in there. And so one of the things that will come up from Roger's potential and future Secretary of State will say, well, Germany's a very important ally of the United States. How are we going to try to decouple Germany from our relation with China? And you're going to run it, and the guy in the back of the room working on the NSC for Roger will point out Jamestown book and say, you know, there's a very interesting book put out by the Jamestown Foundation, and there's a chapter on Germany in this book that talks about decoupling, how Germany is trying to decouple from its relationship with China. And it said, well, Germany's trying to decouple from its relationship with China. I didn't even know that was trying to happen. Well, sir, there's a chapter in this book, and there's an element in that book that talks about that. It's not saying they're pushing it, but they have the Germans talked about it. So from a U.S. policy perspective, how we think about China and how this region develops, when we start pushing whatever policy President Robinson has, it will be decided about whether they'll go a full throttle decoupling or what they will do with China, because it's going to be a part of that argument. And the other part of that argument will be the impact on the Baltic states. So these are relevant policy issues that Otto and Olevs in this book that they put together and really matter, and it's important because whatever's happening with China, whether it's arming Russia or not arming Russia or importing grain from Ukraine, whatever happens, China's shadow in this region is going to matter in U.S. policy, and it's going to matter in Europe, because it's not going to go back. U.S. policy is not going to go back to what it was before, okay? It's evident now as the United States is now cracking down on Chinese investment in computer chips and the export of U.S. technology to China, that our position is getting tougher, okay? No doubt about that. But within that environment are going to be our allies. And we need to understand what's happening. We need to know what's happening with Finland. We need to know what's happening with China in the Arctic and how that affects things. There's a chapter in this book also on Greenland, you know? And everyone remembers the famous squabble that happened between the U.S. and China over Greenland. So these are the types of things, issues of leverages that we need to look at. But another thing that's coming up that's very strategically important is the emerging analogies between the Baltic states and Taiwan. Now, people would say, well, what analogies exist? I'm sorry, Mr. Howard, I don't understand what you're saying. And the point is that everybody now is following the lessons of the Ukraine war, okay? They're looking at a variety of different things that are happening. They're looking at Ukrainian missile strikes inside of Berdyansk, moving inside of Russia, and you see the attacks on the Ingles Air Force Base by Ukraine. And increasingly what we're seeing is that Ukraine cannot stop, and it can't be a punching bag for Russia. And so what Ukraine is trying to do is strike back against Russian territory. And this is directly analogous to Taiwan. Because last week, according to the Wall Street Journal, Michael Gordon had an article. U.S. had war games. U.S. had war games on Taiwan, and within 1 week, the U.S. forces had exhausted, according to the results of the war game, as reported by the Wall Street Journal yesterday, or today, by Michael Gordon. The U.S. in those exercises ran out of anti-shipping missiles, okay? And this happened within 1 week. So Taiwan's ability to disrupt a Chinese attack and the U.S. ability to defend Taiwan matter because the U.S. defense industrial production base is not at the point where it can help these countries and help Taiwan. So, fast forward, why am I talking about why is this important for the Baltic states? Well, what city is in the firing line of Russian attack on the Baltics? Narva, okay? Tallinn, or Riga. Riga's 30 minutes flying time from Pskov province, you know, directly within the gun sights of Russian multiple launch rocket systems attacks and ballistic missiles. So will the U.S. and its NATO allies sit back and watch Narva and Riga be reduced to rubble in the same way we've seen many different Ukraine repeatedly attacked? So why is this important? Because what the U.S. will be deciding on, and I think matters greatly, is whether the U.S. will have HIMARS, and if Narva and Riga start to be attacked, what is going to be our policy? Are we going to sit back and watch them be reduced to rubble and then just fire back at Russian positions on the other side of the border? Or are they going to go for deep preventative type of actions to prevent Russia from doing that? It's a relevant policy question because, as many of you are following, people are critics of the Ukraine war saying, don't risk World War III. Russia's got nukes. We've got to be worried, okay? We shouldn't think about retaliation. But, you know, one of the lessons of war is whether Taiwan or whether Estonia or whether the Baltic states will, in the case of a firing war, and the lessons of the war in Ukraine, whether they will sit back and be a punching bag for the Russians or whether Taiwan will be a punching bag for the Chinese. We don't know. But this is where the analogies begin and where the lessons of Ukraine affect this war, affect how we think about this region, and also how we think about Taiwan. Because at the end of the day, this area is all about trade and economics. Just as Napoleon's continental system was about economic coercion, China is also trying to engage and develop economic coercion over Europe through its trade ties with Germany. And how the United States stands in between this is going to be very, very important. This week, last week, we saw Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Central Asia. But anytime you talk to U.S. Pacific War, Indo-PACOM military people, all they talk about is the Pacific, but nobody ever talks about Eurasia. You know, they have all these war games, but nobody ever talks about what strategic importance of Central Asia is in our policy and strategy. So again, this is Mackinder, this is Heartland, it's geopolitics, it's the concepts of many of the things that the geopolitician Victor Brzezinski outlined in his book that he wrote years ago called Game Plan, which was one of the books. And the Grand Chessboard was a follow-on book that he wrote that addressed this area. But this area is really, really changing, and the Baltic states are really caught up in that. So on that note, I think I'll finish my talk, but I hope you come out of here. We got to have context and understand what's happening in this area to understand what China's doing, where it may go, what its policies will be in Europe, and how it will affect future President of the United States, Roger Robinson's future agenda when he runs for re-election, which I'm fully supporting.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Howard.
Joking.
Well, you know, as much as I'm permitted to comment on American domestic politics, I would certainly second the nomination, because the last time Mr. Robinson was in office and in the White House, we of course know that he was the one who helped to design the sanctions against the Soviet Union that brought us our liberty. So I think we should appreciate that. And I think this would be a great pretext to give floor to Mr. Robinson to speak more about the financial avenues and challenges that we have in interaction with China.
Well, thank you very much, Otto. And I think, thank you, Glenn. I'd rather be an appointed official at NSC, to be frank about it. But I'd like to start by just, of course, seconding Representative Bacon's remarks about the extraordinary nature of the Baltic states. I mean, the courage, tenacity, determination, moral compass, and values on display every day to resist, push back in every way possible against totalitarian police states, notably Russia and China. You can't find a more solid front, if you will, than what we possess to our great benefit in the Baltic states, much like the Ukrainians and their tremendous struggle to not only preserve their own freedoms, but ours as well. I mean, you can hear that, and it's become kind of perhaps overused in some ways, but I don't think it ever gets old, because if we fail to understand that, then we have no clue what we're talking about in terms of funding and sacrifices and equipping, even though it may deplete our stockpiles as allies in U.S. and Europe. An infinitesimally small price to pay for the sacrifice being made by the Ukrainians on our behalf, and we can never forget that. So with that said, I agree with Glenn, of course, that we are very much in an economic and financial struggle here. This has been my specialty for, I guess, 48 years now, and I would only want to make a couple of I think, observations about a new area and what I consider to be the single most compelling, powerful, and achievable source of leverage that the U.S. and our Western allies have that has heretofore not been used against these totalitarian states in anywhere near the level that is possible, and that is the money. You know, the United States has 66% or so of the world's liquidity, meaning investable capital. Our capital markets are the size roughly of the rest of the world's combined. So as the 21st century rolled in, we have the bulk of the money. Just like once upon a time in the early 80s, we had a global monopoly on oil equipment and technology. It was the only such equipment that could go through permafrost, courtesy of our development of North Slope, Alaska, and we used that monopoly to delay by 3 years the first strand of the Siberian gas pipeline of the Soviets, and to kill the second strand, which is today Nord Stream 2. Kill it. It's not up yet, that's for sure. All these decades later, the Soviets, we have to remember, had total hard currency income of about $32 billion a year. 80% of it oil, gas, arms, and gold, 66% of it oil and gas, then and now. And we were able to put the clamps on the life support tubes that were keeping them a going concern. They were spending $16 billion more a year than they made. 100% of that deficit was financed by Western governments and banks. That's a fact. And you can imagine the face of President Reagan when I told him that for the first time. He always suspected that the Soviets could never hold on because of a command economy, no incentives, no technological dynamism, et cetera, no entrepreneurship, but nobody had ever told him the numbers, and that was my, I guess, small claim to fame in terms of being able to frame an economic and financial strategy that they couldn't get away from. And we did just kill their hard currency cash flow. We killed their external sources of financing. We drove oil prices down by having the Saudis pump 2 million barrels of oil secretly, decontrolling prices at the wellhead, taking oil down to $10 a barrel. For every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil, it cost the Soviets $1 billion. Okay? So that's a little quick rundown as to why there's not a Soviet Union today and why 300 million people went free without a shot fired. I don't think I've ever done it faster than that. So anyway, the point being, what have we then allowed to happen with the Chinese? Well, let's start with the fact that for the past 25 years, they've come to our capital markets for trillions of dollars, with a T. 3, 6, no one really knows the true number, because a lot of it's in passive investment funds, like index funds, exchange-traded funds. It's a complicated business, but it's in the trillions, that's for sure. Again, think about it. And this is true of Europe, too. American and European retail investors unwittingly transferring their hard-earned retirement dollars and euros, etc., to the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party. Full stop. It's just that simple. And who are the 5,000 companies, over 5,000 Chinese companies, in the portfolios of the American people today because of no diligence, no oversight, no regulatory framework, no SEC scrutiny, no action by the Treasury Department or the National Economic Council. Why? Because they're all revolving street, Wall Street types anyway, right? And they're all going to go back to jobs at BlackRock and Goldman, etc. So we got a fundamental problem there that's cost us. But the point being, I'll tell you, and again, these aren't opinions, these are empirical facts. These are Chinese companies that equip concentration camps like Hikvision. These are companies that engage in the trafficking in forced labor. These are the folks that built the surveillance state. And these are the types that are aiding and abetting genocide in Xinjiang and so forth. Not to mention, they're the ones that built and militarized the islands in the South China Sea. They're the ones building the 5 classes of submarine-launched ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines that China has under production today. We financed, and we can give you the stats on this, the last 2 aircraft carriers of China in the U.S. capital markets. The firm that did that hypersonic glide vehicle, it was funded in part out of the New York Stock Exchange. Now, it would be tragic, you know, if this was just a story. It's a lot worse when it's true. And today, there are Chinese companies in the Federal Thrift Savings Plan of our military, of our congressmen and women, of all executive branch officials, from the Joint Chiefs to the intelligence community. They're holding 35 Chinese companies in their portfolios today, all reporting to the CCP. Does anybody care? It's just an amazing situation. We came up finally with the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, unanimously passed by the Senate and the House. But what's the real story there? They only looked at listed companies on NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange. That's 260. What about the 900 in the over-the-counter market? What about the 4,000 A-share companies drawn directly from domestic Chinese exchanges? Now, this is a long, complicated tale, and I clearly don't have the time before I get the hook from Olevs and Otto to shorten this thing or sign off, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about it in the Q's and A's. But technology security, terribly important. Trade, tariffs, big subject, important subject. Currency manipulation gets its fair share. You never hear anything about the money. You never hear anything about the money. Why? By design. Because it's the money that took down the Soviet Union. It's the money that's going to take down China, the Chinese Communist Party, to be precise. And that's what we need to be all about. When we're trying to advance human rights, when we're trying to penalize national security violations, let's go after those publicly traded Chinese companies. Let's go after the prestige that we're giving them to be listed on our exchanges, like some good housekeeping seal of approval for them to go around the world raising ever more money. Not to mention the billions, hundreds of billions they're attracting from unwitting American investors. So I could want to talk sometimes more about all of that. But I would just close, in the shortness of time, by saying that there's good news here, which is this is our money. And when I say ours, for the Americans in the room, this is your public pension systems of your states, of the federal government. This is what you think you've got at BlackRock and Vanguard and Fidelity, your indexes at MSCI, FTSE Russell, Dow S&P. All of these household names are trafficking in companies that have fundamentally are in the business of undermining our security and spitting in the face of our values. And those, ladies and gentlemen, are the facts of the case. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I will give the floor to the President of the Baltic Security Foundation to add his perspectives to the debate.
Thanks, Otto. Yes, of course, here, and thanks, Roger, for your excellent presentation, and thanks, Mr. Howard, for your insights into the book we are opening today. Of course, here, I would like to emphasize what Roger was saying, that we are dealing with a totalitarian state. And this totalitarian state is striving for global leadership.
using their assets, using their resources and capital. And actually, it was a quite shocking reading for myself when we put together this book. What is the current reach? What is the depth and intensity and the real presence of Chinese government of PRC in the Baltic Sea region? And it's really alarming. I really encourage to read you this book. So it's covering all the Baltic Sea region, it's the Baltic countries, it's Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Poland, and Germany. And when we look on the particular cases, so what we can see that in many ways the private business is driving the process of Chinese influence, Chinese presence and engagement economically in the Baltic Sea region of countries, and not only there, this is what they do everywhere. So this is the first thing that we should really comprehend in our minds, and in many ways politicians and maybe secret services and national security institutions understand what is going on, but in the minds of ordinary citizens, entrepreneurs, businessmen, it's in many ways this is something that it's beyond something that they are really thinking about. They are thinking about profits, and we see where it can end, where it can lead us. Let's say when we take a look on Germany, on China's investment in the German ports and infrastructure, which then can really compromise our collective security arrangement. And here are many answers that we can provide. And Roger, you get the best answers on those questions: how to minimize, how to compromise their ability to raise capital and their resources. But in Europe, we have quite promising initiatives, which is the 3 Seas initiative, which we are very proud and really appreciate that Americans are lately really about to support this initiative throughout Europe, as we really have our resources that should be consolidated, and those investments we can make in our critical infrastructure and build roads and build ports and railroads using our own investment and not relying on Chinese capital. And if we take a look on academic environment, I remember Jim Olson in Texas A&M University when I was there like 8 years ago. He was talking about Chinese students spying, conducting this academic and scientific espionage, and I was thinking, really is that so bad here in America, which is actually happening also. It's our case as well throughout Europe, throughout the Baltic Sea region. So these facts and figures are quite alarming, and I would encourage us to think more of this, to be aware. But first, really, let's raise the awareness of those processes, and go ahead with responding to those challenges. Thank you.
Now, as we move on from the matters of military strategy, of finance, of the matter of collective development and the way how we would be able to fund it, I think important keyword that we heard in all of the first speakers' addresses was the question of values. And for that particular aspect, I would like Ms. Liu to give particular attention to, as she would have a very interesting case and story to tell from her experience in the matters of human rights and the matters of values as we discussed it today.
Well, I would like first to say that I am really honored to be sitting on the same panel as my hero, Roger Robinson. I met him more than a dozen years ago when I listened to him giving a speech at Victim of Communism Foundation, and I immediately went out and downloaded everything I could find on the internet that he ever written. He was inspiring. Now, he is absolutely correct that the Chinese Communist regime is vulnerable. You know, its growth is driven by export. I just give you one comparison. United States revenue from export is about 10%, but for the PRC range between 30% to 45%. So if the democracies come together and decide to do something, they can. But unfortunately, United States cannot lead if its China policy is, how should I say, ineffective, as the current Biden administration is. It emphasizes on both cooperation and competition. Now, at the very least, it undermines each other. And at the very worst, it cancels each other out. You cannot do the opposite and wish to win. Now, the second thing is that I'm not sure they really want to win. They assume, and I think it's a very much a wrong assumption, is that they can coexist with tyranny. Democracy cannot coexist with tyranny. It is existential enemy. If you go to Jefferson's memorial and you see at the memorial carved in marble, Jefferson swearing to fight tyranny in all its forms. Now, the Chinese communist tyranny is the worst tyranny China have ever seen. It is not from the Chinese tradition, and it is never existed in China's long history. It's totalitarian, it controlled everything. It actually killed more Chinese people than all China's invaders combined. And that includes the Mongols, the Manchus, and the Japanese with their modern weapons of mass destruction. Now, the Chinese communist regime benefit from democracy's ignorance of its true nature, benefit from the ignorance of China's history, the politics and tradition, and it benefit from its inability to analyze the regime's the structure of power. They keep using analogy and mirror image analysis. It doesn't work because it is not the same. They are not like us. They are thugs, but very, very sophisticated. also the problem of our human rights establishment. Now, when I started this, it was 1972. I was 18 years old. I was in China. I was looking on a great deal of suffering. And then finally, I said to myself, no people should have to suffer like this. It's unnecessary. But how do you help the people to help themselves from the systematic violence that's unleashed by Mao? There's mob violence. No government in China had ever ruled China through mob violence, and Mao did. And then it's slightly improved by Deng's state violence. It's less unpredictable than Mao's mob violence, but it's still violence. And at the time, I was just become a US citizen. And I thought, I better study the Constitution. And I even memorized the Bill of Rights. And then when I went to take my citizen test, they didn't ask me any question about the Constitution. But I did memorize the Bill of Rights. And then it came into my head, that's what the Chinese people needs, the Bill of Rights. There are some place, some area of their person, of their family, of their belief, the state cannot violate. And I start promoting human rights. And I've been doing it ever since. And I can tell you, it's been pretty dismal. I've been doing it for 50 years. I'm ancient, I'm an old lady. The only good news I got was last week when the US Congress set up its first selected committee on the CCP. And they, the leadership of both parties selected their most photogenic and their youngest congressman on the panel. It's great news. But, you remain to be seen how they do. They're one of their big tasks is public education. For all democracy, their support comes from an informed public. And without knowledge, they cannot support policy. And that is the greatest task of the Select Committee. The second greatest task is to come up with an effective, practical, and realistic China policy. Now, one last sentence before I close, which is that most people now talk about human rights all the time. But human rights are more than just virtue signaling. It has to be effective. You cannot support trade and support human rights. And almost, otherwise it's just hypocrisy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful addresses and the information that we received, both in terms of military and strategy, and of course the human rights component, which is important for us so that we will not remain a democracy is an ignorant democracy. I would agree to that. Let me open the floor up for questions to our panelists, for those questions that you would like to ask now. So I see the first question there, and I feel that on this side there will also be a question. So if you could please introduce yourself and ask your question. We do not have microphones that we could hand out, but if it is more convenient, you can also come and ask the question here, as you wish. Or you can ask the question, I can repeat it.
I'm Ken Meyer, Foreign Affairs. I'd like to ask Mr. Robertson, when you talk about our finances, China you're talking about Chinese business in China or in this country?
We're talking about the purchase of Chinese stocks and bonds, full stop. So this is the securities industry. It's not in the corporate venue. It's not the financing of joint ventures and projects and all of the, shall we say, traditional financing matters. This is the capital markets, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, over-the-counter markets. As I say, the A-share markets, it should be called, not to mention Milan, Paris, London, Frankfurt, Zurich, who's the new best friend of the Chinese, we're told, who did more IPOs by orders of magnitude than any other country last year. Gee, I wonder why. You know, you think Zurich performed any meaningful human rights and national security diligence? Do you think that they care that, for example, not one Chinese company in the United States, of the over 5,000 that we have present here, are compliant with U.S. federal securities laws? Not one. Think about it. So, as far as fiduciary responsibility is concerned, I would say that Zurich was able to attract that much business because it's just a cynical free lunch program for fees. So that's the, I'm sorry to digress from your question, but that's the basic answer, is the nature of where tens of trillions of dollars of funds under management. This is the biggest money in the world. All of the other financings you're talking about are chump change next to this. This is the mothership. This is critical mass. If the Chinese don't have access to hundreds of billions of dollars, underlined dollars, a year, it's adios muchacho for the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, that's how straightforward this is. And that's why you never hear about the money.
Thank you. We had a question over here, please.
You know, I'm older than you, Dimon, but you make me feel like a sophomore. I mean, there's a lot of knowledge here, and I thank you. Could you explain simply, for one who doesn't really know the Baltics very well, but I could talk about the Czech Republic and the Chinese policy to the Czech Republic is to undermine it and buy politicians and bribery and intimidation. All that I could back up and explain and have. But what are they doing in the Baltics to undermine those societies? I should know.
Well, we have an expert on the Czech Republic here, so.
But he knows the Czech Republic. He needs the Baltic guy and guys.
Well, let me explain the CCP's global strategy, and then my friend here will focus into the Baltics. Mao has very famously said that he has two magic weapons, which the CCP as a warrior would wield. Now, one of the weapons is the United Front, which is the stealth war, and a war of influence and more spies, and then to basically weaken your adversary until you are so weakened that the military, which is the other sword, the magic weapon, come and we do a coup d'etat. And the stealth war is composed of two components. One is intelligence. The other one is propaganda. Propaganda isn't really just messaging. Messaging is a big part of it. The second part is control. For instance, the CCP controls all the media on all platforms in the United States. And very stealthily, it now controls all the Chinese language media around the globe. And that it's not a small. There's 60 million Chinese living in diaspora. And in Taiwan, before they woke up to it, and I was screaming at them, CCP money controls currently about 80% of Taiwan's media. That is, and now you actually have some really top elite establishment American helping the CCP because they pay them very well to buy media in other languages. Africa is one area. I'm sure the Baltic is another. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. I would say here we can clearly see three domains when Chinese are seeking their influence across the Baltic Sea region and the Baltic countries particularly, which of course is economic, political and military, of course. The question is how successful they are, what is the success of their activity. If we are thinking in economic terms, it's not a big thing for the Baltic countries, and as you probably know, we kind of refrain from the major projects of the Chinese government in the region. Lithuanians, of course, kind of took their leadership in that regard. But what might be, in political terms, Chinese like ambition and what they would desire, what they are thinking, what they might think about, what is quite what is a temptation for them, is that we are small countries and both members of NATO and European Union. And this is something that, so why they would see, such a small countries still important players. So we are members of those large global structures and European regional structures. And this is, there are avenues for them to try to corrupt through their influences, through kind of politics. They can try to advance their interests politically as well. And the other question is how successful they are. I would not say that they are. They are not successful in this domain as well. And for military domain, this shifts more to the north. They have the Arctic and Nordic countries. They are having their projects, which has a dual meaning, which are scientific and military the same. It's not the case of the three Baltic countries. Maybe Otto, you can also add something in this regard.
Well, here I think certainly we could mention the aspect of different technologies that they are interested about, because if we would compare some of the investment and presence restrictions that you had instituted in Western Europe, they were instituted in the Nordic countries a little bit later. So I think it was both for geographic but also technological reasons why you would have additional Chinese interest in that region that could be useful not only for their economic buoyancy in terms of diversified investment, but also in terms of the technology that they could use to utilize in military realm, spying and other ways. So if they are unable to design it themselves, so why not use their resources to take it away? It's also the question about values and how we approach the respect to property, intellectual property, and the matters that we discussed in terms of values. Thank you. Now, if we would have another question here, please.
This is Xiaosheng with Voice of America. Two quick questions. The first one is the Congressman Bacon seemed to suggest that the U.S. can consider stationing some permanent forces in the Baltic states. And do you have anything to add to that proposal? And how can the U.S. further step up our military presence in Baltic states? And if the U.S. did that, we worry that it would divert our resources and attention away from the second question is, any recommended action for the Baltic states to further shift away from China and establish closer ties with Taiwan?
Okay, the question had several parts to it. What Congressman Bacon suggested was talking about a permanent U.S. military presence in the Baltic states. And for those who don't follow it, what's there now is they have the enhanced forward presence battle groups represented by several allied NATO states. And so you don't have U.S. ground forces there inside the three Baltic states on a permanent basis. Okay, they're rotational in nature, but what the U.S. permanent military presence is in Poland. That's where the forces have been, and that's where the U.S. buildup has been developing. And what Congressman Bacon was alluding to was that if we don't put U.S. forces on the ground in the Baltic states, that we perhaps consider the idea of putting more U.S. forces inside of Poland. And so that is certainly on the table. Senator Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal who was arguing that the U.S. needed to defeat Russia and Ukraine using Ukrainian forces, or else if we don't do it, we'll have to reconsider our military presence in Europe on a permanent basis. And he's arguing for full support for Ukraine, so we don't have to avoid that. So right now, the rotational forces with the EMP battle groups are certainly sophisticated enough that act as a tripwire force. So the point is that if Russia crosses the border, the tripwire forces would engage them, making a full NATO as members of NATO, but also would be NATO forces. So that elevate the risk. The other part of your question was about Taiwan. What was the?
Yes, about the Baltics and Taiwan. Should there be this closer relationship between the Baltic states and Taiwan?
Absolutely, there should be a closer relationship. I mean, they should all recognize Taiwan, and if Taiwan goes independent, they should consider doing that. I mean, they certainly have increased their presence inside, the diplomatic presence inside the Baltic states with the Taiwanese, who certainly have had more engagement, and because of that. There's also military equipment sales and things like that can occur between the Baltic states and Taiwan, and there certainly can be there's certainly the level of attention between the Baltic states and Taiwan has increased dramatically to the point to where it's now very much on the visits agendas for members of the governments of this region are going to Taiwan on a regular basis, and that wasn't happening 5 years ago, or 6 years ago. I mean, certainly when President Trump came into office, things started changing a lot. But in some Baltic states, and not to give favoritism to Lithuania, but Lithuania kind of was one of the first states to really start moving ahead with ties to Taiwan. And I'll say on that one note is that the country that's really developing close relations with Taiwan is Poland. And you're also seeing a military relationship between South Korea and Poland as well. And just South Korea is becoming a major arms provider to this whole, the Nordic, what they call Baltic Five, is that the term they use? So it's, South Korea is really emerging quickly, especially for Finland, as an arms supplier. So that's why I was trying to highlight this interconnection between Taiwan, Asia, and the Baltic states. And many of you follow Xi's statements. If you read China Brief, you'll know that we've had some articles about Xi has been talking about an Asian NATO, and China's reaction to what he perceives as an Asian NATO led by the United States, meaning a series of U.S. allies increasingly grouping together in the form of a NATO in the Pacific, Asian NATO. But in reaction to that, Xi is talking about closer ties with Central Asia and Eurasia as a way to counterbalance Asian NATO, what China calls Asian NATO. So that's why today I was talking about Mackinder, Heartland, and Eurasia, because China, many people forget, is also a continental power. They look at the Chinese Navy, but they forget China is also a continental power, building railroads and Belt and Road Initiative transportation infrastructure in Eurasia, all the way into the Baltic. So hopefully I answered your question.
Thank you very much. Would we have another one question? Yes, please.
I have one final question. I'm Emily Ashbridge from Texas A&M. I think you're mentioning kind of the connectivity between the Eurasian continent and also the Indo-Pacific. When you were talking about the problematic nature of a competition and cooperation, those undermining or at times canceling each other out, arguing for more competition, I'm wondering how that connects with the allies and partners framework of the Indo-Pacific strategy and competing with China. If allies and partners are more hesitant to work with the U.S., if we have more of an aggressive or competitive model, how does that influence the U.S. going at it alone first?
But the United States has to choose. Governing is about choice. Thinking, as President Bush used to say, I am the decider. You can choose either to cooperate with CCP party state, or you can choose to be competitive, but you can't do both.
And what about the allies and partners piece?
The allies, it's good to have allies. But if you have a wrong policy, your allies are useless. And that's why the select committee becomes very important, because they go through the process of public education and deliberation and assessment to come up a workable, practical, and effective China policy. China policy has been wrong since 1971. It's been shifting, but it's still wrong.
Thank you very much. As we still have another panel to go, I believe we will have the chance to discuss these and some other issues afterwards. But let me use this opportunity to applaud our distinguished panelists, and thank you for the great debate.